Thank you. Bye. Good luck.
Good
Good night.
night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Chris, I'm very happy that you're here. We cannot hear you now. Okay,
I'm
Chris,
sorry,
I
Henrik,
now
for the
that's it.
delay in joining. I'm glad to be here now.
Very happy that you're here. If you want to start,
Yeah.
whenever. Yeah.
Um, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people on a Friday evening giving up their time to join Henrik and his colleagues. And many thanks, Henrik, for inviting me and for organising the event. If I say a little bit about myself, my name is Chris Munt. I live in the UK. My professional background is in social work, and I did that for many years, and then moved into the NHS and worked more almost exclusively around transforming mental health services to make them more aligned with recovery values and principles. I did that for a number of years until I reached the point of accepting that we were only making inroads at the margins, and really the NHS were only conceding ground that they were ready to concede anyway. So I did feel that the whole process of my involvement, but also many of my colleagues as well, was very tokenistic. And the whole recovery movement for me in the United Kingdom had become colonized by professionals, by institutions, and lost its original sort of civil rights momentum and the delivery of campaigning for significant change, not just, little bits of progress in areas that were far from the central deliberation of myself and my lived experience colleagues here in the UK. So because of that dissatisfaction, I then moved back into academia. I had been a visiting lecturer since the early 2000s, and mainly working at Hertfordshire University. We were very supportive of the recovery movement as it came to our shores, and Hertfordshire University was the first academic institution that set up a centre for mental health recovery. It was a real pathfinder time, and we were in operation for about 4 years, and really did make some inroads, and certainly influenced the thinking of clinicians, social workers, occupational therapists, all sorts of professions. But sometimes that was an uphill slog because we were trying to turn round attitudes of care through control and care through compliance and care through pharmacology. Throughout all of my working life, I've always also struggled to manage my own lived experience of mental illness. I remember hearing voices at a preschool age. I was probably 3 or 4 when I first sensed that I was different from my peers, that what I heard wasn't a common experience for everyone else. And I became quite ashamed and guilty about them because my voices were always very derogatory, trying to sort of get me to do bad things, to think badly of myself, and were always intrusive It was very difficult when I moved into school age and tried to progress and manage the academic expectations while at the same time having voices that were telling me to go kill myself, fuck off, you're worthless, you'll never amount to anything, you're a complete failure. So I'm sure many of you here, have heard that sort of testimony before, but it's something that, has really sort of marked my life. And from time to time when I've been in crisis, I've had to access mental health support, both in acute settings and in the community. And, my experience is that I didn't have any violence or aggression directed at me, but I certainly observed that happening to other service users and patients, although I was subject routinely to humiliations through shouting at me, through informing me that if I didn't toe the line, my medical records would show that I was a troublemaker and that they would never let me go. So, even though I had an understanding of the mental health system as a social worker, it didn't prepare me for the reality of being within those services. And over time, those experiences made me decide to do something outside of the system and try to affect change from outside, because my attempt to work within the structures and from within those silos produced very little unsubstantial and material change. So I have found working within academia, where I teach students and I call upon my professional background in social work, but also my lived experience of accessing services. So I've found that experience extremely cathartic and extremely beneficial to me. It gives me an opportunity to share those experiences for people that are going to be out there delivering those services. And I try and instill within them the principles of having an unconditional high regard for each and every person and in each and every setting and at each and every time. There should be no discrimination. There should be no caveats. Those high values and high principles should apply everywhere and to everyone. But also research. I first became involved with Enric in a project where we are involved in a pan-European study into institutional violence. And I was the lead author and I wrote a chapter of 10,000 words, which articulated victims within the United Kingdom who were subject to humiliation, violence, sexual assault, verbal intent, aggression, threats, implied threats, lots of coercion. And even though I'd had that lived experience myself, I wasn't prepared wholly for some of the accounts that were shared with me. And it took many months before the cohort that I was fortunate to assemble. It took many months to build up a trust and a rapport and to prepare the ground for people telling me their stories, which really was how I approached my social work role. It was always about listening to individuals' accounts of their lives rather than being overly concerned with professional reports that were detailing that person's lives. So I always believe in the first person narrative and the power and the impacts of that. So we agreed with that with it within the group terms of reference that bound us all together. Um, and for me, it was all about a social work approach, which is called permission, preparedness, and pace. So it was with the permission of the cohort. How they wish to share their story. It was preparedness on my part to be open, to be receptive, to be calm, to listen far more than I spoke. And it was working at the pace that worked for everyone. And slowly but surely, we were able to draw out some of the themes from those shattering experiences. And we agreed that I would write 1,000 words, then I would share that amongst my co-researchers, co-authors for their comments, amendments. Then I would work that in, and then I would resend the 1,000 words back to them, and then I would work on another 1,000 words. And then we did that constantly, refreshing, working with consent. And it really was, and I know it sounds quite trite, but I was holding the pen, but it was the cohort that were guiding that pen. And it was their words that I was writing as much as possible. I do believe that when it comes to recording the accounts of people who have experienced such trauma, that we really shouldn't stray into areas of editing, reauthoring, or reframing. So I do believe, I don't know what other colleagues present feel, but I've come across pieces of research and studies from people with a lived experience, and it's quite impenetrable. It's almost as if people with a lived experience are desperate to find the acclaim of their academic and professional colleagues by being as technical and rigid in their research as possible. But for me, it was important to not over professionalize or over academicize the process. I wanted it to be a piece of work that everybody could access. And that didn't mean dumbing it down and making it simple, but I just wanted it to be accessible to everyone. And that was certainly one of the priorities from the cohort. So bit by bit, we got the 10,000 words ready. And in fact, there are about 12 chapters that other colleagues were working on. And we were the only group that was driven entirely by lived experience, and we were first to submit. And there was very little reworking that we had to do once the editor had the submitted copy, very few bits of rework. And now that is with the publishers, and they're happy with the way it's been written and recorded. And one of the priorities with people was that their anonymity was absolutely protected. People were so fearful of retaliation and retribution coming their way for having the courage to honestly retell those stories. And they had tried to raise concerns at their poor treatment in many cases. But I don't know what people's experiences are of trying to complain about institutional failings, but it is a minefield, and it's like a silo within a silo, and it's like a maze within a maze, and a puzzle without a key. It's very difficult to find the stamina and the support to really see a complaint through, because there are so many attempts to deflect what you were trying to say, to diminish it, and to dismiss it. Um, if you consider some of the assumptions that are out there in the general public about people with mental illness, that they're confused, they're delusional, they're not trustworthy, especially if you come across people with a diagnosis of personality disorder, when there can be added to those slurs, that people are malicious, manipulative, and malign, and trying to impact your complaint whilst coming up against all of those blocks and barriers and obstacles is extremely difficult. And I don't know about other people in other countries, but the NHS here is revered, absolutely revered. And in many cases, that's justified, but not in all cases. And there's an unwillingness to accept that sometimes in some places, some people do terrible things and commit terrible harm and leave people traumatized. I often share with international colleagues that in the UK, if you have a learning disability, or if you have a diagnosis of mental illness, you are the only patient group that gets called a service user. Yeah. If I had cancer, I'd be referred to as a cancer patient. If I was diabetic, I'd be referred to as having diabetes. But because I have a mental illness, I'm not classed in the same respect as those other domains. Because I'm a mental health patient, I am a service user, and I'm apart from other groups. And the same goes for learning disability. And if you look at the recorded crimes against patients, it's largely within the mental health community and in the learning disability community. And for me, that says a great deal about othering. It's almost that some people regard us as not necessarily unworthy, but when we complain or assert ourselves, there are all sorts of assumptions made about our motivations. And there are still people out there who consider mental illness as being a mental defect. I've often come across paperwork from the 1970s and the 1980s, where people with mental illness are still referred to as being imbeciles and cretins. Now, really, they should have been left back in the 19th century. But that still prevails. When we closed down the long stay institutions in the 1970s and repatriated people to the community, because of the massive amount of concern that was focused on those institutions about the quality of care, the quality of treatment, and the safety of patients. But when we repatriated them to the community, which was a very good thing, how did we staff those new services? Largely, we staffed them with the people that worked in those institutions, which were found to be not fit for purpose. And that is why the community care in the UK is still tainted and contaminated from some of those attitudes and assumptions. And for me, it's all about rights, justice, and accountability. We have a right to be safe. We have the right to therapeutic treatment. We seek justice when things go wrong, when people are forcefully medicated, when they have their records falsified, when they're pinned down and forcibly medicated. These things cannot be justified. And when that happens, we seek accountability. But there's always caveated accountability. One of the phrases, I don't know if this happens in places where you live and work, but when there's an inquiry here into the safety of services, there's always a response saying that lessons will be learned. Well, it's about time that those lessons were learned. We can't keep rolling out that line that lessons will be learned, because that simply isn't good enough. I think one of the things that holds back the service user and patient movement in the UK is that we are too nice. We are too understanding. We're too polite. I'd like to see some of the assertive action that other countries and other patient and service user groups take. We need to insist and demand that change happens, not over the long term. Some of the things that could bring about change don't need wholesale investment and transformation. There are some quick wins that could be put in place very, very easily. But that doesn't happen because the institutions are so preoccupied with their reputation and their standards within the inspection and scrutiny realm that they just won't own fully what's happened, what are the failings, and what steps have been taken to ensure that this won't happen again. And for me, part of the rights and justice is, I believe, anyone that's been treated violently or with disrespect, that have been humiliated, are entitled to reparations, proper reparations, not just for them, but those that cared for them as well, their family members, their friends, who have to pick up those pieces and proceed afterwards and support them with that trauma that will be a legacy for them. So apologies aren't enough. It's about systematic and sustained change. Some institution fail so consistently, they shouldn't have a future. They shouldn't have a present. And I believe that service users should be front and center of an entirely independent and new body that scrutinizes and audits these institutions and had the power to discipline, dismantle, and dismiss. Now, when I share this with some of the institutions here in the UK, you know, I can see a sharp intake of breath. Very few people would disagree with me or challenge me head on, but there is an assumption that you know, that's unrealistic. And I would just say that we need to be more ambitious and more fearless. We are too akin to listening to the narrative of institutions that we're doing our best. We've got limited resources. We have political pressures made upon us. Well, that's not our problem. That's your problem. You've got to do something about that. I'm not quite sure how much longer you wanted me to go on for, Henrik. I think I've come to the end of what I had intended to say. I don't know if you want to take questions now or later on.
You decide. This comes. It connects with what we last commented with Daniels about the banning of coercive measures. You are saying it for, center and front the users, as you can dismiss and discipline people that is really abusing you.
Yeah.
I was. Anybody wish to ask anything? If not, you can continue, Chris. It's wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy for any questions. Do feel free.
I have a question. I don't know where I am in the queue, but I'm just going to throw it out here. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
I'm so sorry. I missed the introduction, and I asked in chat for someone to explain, and Enrique graciously kind of gave you an introduction. Probably didn't do you justice, but I love your presentation. I don't even know where to begin. I have so many questions, and other people might want to have their questions answered. So
Well, Sarah, I could give you some of the background that I shared before
that's
that you
very
missed
kind of
out.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
my name is Chris Munt. I live in the UK. I've got a professional background in social work and did that for many years. And across different care groups, I worked with children and families. I worked in safeguarding. I also worked with juvenile justice. Trying to prevent young, damaged people being given punitive sentences in custody, which for me was monstrous and still is. If there's one thing that angers me is when I see young, damaged men and women going into prisons. You know, I can't think of anything more punitive and damaging to people that have already been traumatized. So that's a bit of my background, but really what I was sharing was the research that I'm doing now. So one of the pieces of research that I recently did was to be a lead author on a pan-European study into institutional violence. And I was talking about that. But yeah, really, my position is that I work from outside the system now to affect change, because I became so demoralized at trying to chip away from within the service, and my attempts being corporatized, colonized, and co-opted by the dominant institution. Does that help, Sarah, give a bit of context?
That helps enormously. Thank you so much. I too work outside the system. I work for an organization called Mind Freedom International, and I come to this work. I've been doing activism, which you could loosely define as promoting human rights in the mental health system, in the global mental health system.
Right.
I come to this work from not as a you don't like the word service user, so I'm not going to use the word consumer. I am a consumer of mental health system, but consumer mental health systems, but I'm happy with my mental health services. So I don't come to this work through my own bad experiences in the mental health system. I come to this work through my daughter's experiences in the mental health system. And I wish I'm inclined to share my daughter's story, but you have more experience in the area of obtaining impeccable permissions from people. And my daughter is not able to coherently tell her story yet. So I want to tell my story as an eyewitness, only what I've seen and heard. And it's kind of like, how do you advise me to come to a consensus with my daughter who, you know, is in and out of reality, consensus-based reality? How do you advise me to go about the process of getting permission to tell my daughter's story of a person who was subjected to state-sponsored violence, to torture, psychiatric torture? How do you advise me to go, tell her story publicly?
Well, I would certainly try to talk to your daughter when she's more present about the possibility of the two of you collaborating at times where she is present, sort of mentally and emotionally, and feeling secure enough to do so. But if that's not possible, I think as carer, you're close to that first person narrative as you can be. And also you've got your own narrative as your daughter's carer. And I think that I don't know what other colleagues have to say, but even if your daughter was reticent for her to be central to trying to tell that story, you are, I believe, entirely free to share your story, your lived experience of trying to support someone that has been so tragically harmed and poorly treated, poorly understood by the system, with no accountability, no ownership, and left you and your daughter feeling absolutely abused and victimized. So I do believe that even if your daughter is reticent, I still believe that you have your lived experience to share. How does that sit with you, Sarah?
That sits really well with me, because I hear you saying that there's validity in my experience as a caregiver and a carer. And so I feel empowered by your response, but it doesn't completely, like, answer my question, because then it leaves me to be a judge. Well, is my daughter like speaking, because her position is always changing, and so there are times when our stories are in alignment and we are in consensus, but then there's other sides of her that she had, in my opinion, had to develop different ways of coping with being institutionalized. So she developed a kind of a personality to deal with that, the day-to-day horrors. And so she that side of her personality and me are not in consensus. So
maybe, Sarah, maybe that is a central part to your story about that conflicting sort of narrative, where at times your daughter is very focused on the harm that she suffered, and at other times it may shift, and the content and narrative may change, and that's part of the the harm that's been done to her. She may not have that consistency, but your observations are also valid as well. And part of that that confliction that your daughter has is part of the story that you're both struggling with. And it's interesting here, you know, in the UK, you know, I'm not always well regarded by some of my service user colleagues. You know, there are colleagues out there who actually think that institutions are doing a great job and that I'm a bit of a troublemaker. Some people like being given lots and lots of medication so that they're barely functioning. I don't believe in that. I believe that we all have a right to live a life that's outside of the dim, unlit world of being sedated or on a day-by-day basis. We're all entitled to a life, and I'm not anti-medication, but I'm against medication that is on the highest dose, that's not reviewed consistently, and where the prescriber doesn't have a dialogue with the person that they're prescribing to. You know, I just feel that I know that for me, I spent 10 years on controlled antipsychotics, and I robbed my two daughters of a father for 10 years because all I did was slept, ate, slept, ate, slept, ate. And, you know, they were traumatized as much as I was by that experience. So, yeah, it's always a struggle, Sarah, but I feel you have a valid story yourself that should be heard. And I wish you and your daughter well.
Thank you. I have other questions too as well, but I don't want to, you know, hog all the questions, so
Well,
I'll
Sarah,
wait.
you know, I'm happy to share my email details if you wanted to, Enric, if you wanted to share my email details, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you, Chris. That's very generous of you.
Take care, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else wants to ask? If not, Sarah, feel free, I will say. I will make a question, Chris. Do
Yeah.
you believe that the one ordeal was for shunning you to have the voices to begin with? If that was accepted, would not have been intrusive to the point that you were feeling bad about yourself? This is one of the issues. I'm asking because I recently learned that many people doesn't have any voice at all. I mean, it is part of the normal.
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah, you know, I learned very late that hearing voices does not have to be a psychotic symptom. For me, my understanding is that I was the victim of childhood sexual incestuous sexual abuse, and there is a proven correlation between victims of childhood sexual abuse and the development of voice hearing. You know, there's lots of research that has found that to be the case. So I definitely feel that I certainly suffer with paranoia. I certainly do suffer with paranoia, and for that I have a very small dose of olanzapine to sort of help keep that in check. But yeah, my belief, and really it is about our beliefs about diagnosis and symptoms. You know, one of the really freeing things about one of my other problems has been alcoholism. Fortunately, I've been sober for the last 11 years, and it's been the greatest 11 years of my life. The freedom from alcoholism. And the wonderful thing about alcoholism it doesn't matter about what other people believe. It's what you believe. You know, no one cares if the doctor tells them they're an alcoholic. It's for you to decide if you're an alcoholic. And for me, I know that I struggle with voices, with paranoia. Um, um, uh, but I largely am able to manage that myself. And I found ways of living a more productive life outside of the service rather than within. But it's what works for people. I always try to steer clear of prescriptive solutions for people. It's what works for you as an individual. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. Chris, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
Because you brought up the issue of paranoia. I don't use that term a lot, but it's an interesting term. I first started looking into paranoia, and I discovered the work of a individual named Peter Bullimer. You might have heard of Pete.
No, I have to look that up. Yeah, tell
Okay,
me about
okay.
it.
Well, Pete is a trauma survivor. He's a sexual trauma survivor. He lives in the
Right,
UK. He
right.
was formerly institutionalized, and he formed an organization called the Paranoia Network. So
Okay.
when I heard about Pete's work, it was because an organization called the Wildflower Alliance, which is
Mm,
in Massachusetts, was sponsoring Pete to come to a state in the eastern United States called Florida. And so
yeah,
when we found out about him, our family flew out to Florida, and we stayed there for the duration of Pete's 2-day training. And I found it
right.
enormously helpful for our whole family
Mm,
to take the stigma of paranoia off my daughter's shoulders, and for all of us
mm,
to explore as a family
mm,
how we were all where
mm.
we all were on the spectrum of paranoia.
Absolutely.
And I didn't even realize before Pete presented this way that paranoia is actually a spectrum, and all of us fall on
Yes.
the spectrum, and we
Yeah.
kind of come and go on the spectrum depending
Yeah,
on our
I
changing life
fluctuate. I
circumstances.
fluctuate. Yeah. You know, sometimes if someone hasn't replied to a text message within 5 minutes, I'm absolutely catastrophizing and think the worst possible sort of
I
reasons
can
for that.
understand.
But
I've done that too.
other times I can go weeks and weeks and weeks and I hardly notice it. Um, but it's interesting you mentioning that guy. One of the things that helped me reevaluate my relationship with my voices was Ron Coleman. Have you come across Ron Coleman? Uh,
Yeah, I just got back from their house in the Isle of Lewis 2
oh
weeks
my
ago. I
God! Well,
went to their training.
I know Ron and Karen well, and their
I love
children.
Karen.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, for years and years and years, I was told by mental health professionals, do not listen to your voices and definitely don't talk to them. And I met Ron and Karen, and they encouraged me to have a dialogue with my voices. And that has made more progress than years and years and years of counseling, antipsychotic medication, and institutional care. It was so liberating. It really was. Yeah, I can't talk more highly of it. And you talking about your whole family going to see this person in Florida. You know, the things that have helped me have helped my family and my friends, and we all share in that. And it helps them understand me, but it also helps me understand them. Um, and I was thinking of you, Sarah, that certainly in the UK, there still is this sense that carers, particularly family members, are somehow implicit in someone's illness, that they are an active element to that illness. And for me, that's a form of fascism. you know, I see families as potential allies in the struggle to manage the illness, and they shouldn't be seen through suspicious eyes as part of the problem. We've got to leave those assumptions where they belong, in the distant past.
Thank you, Chris. Looking forward to read your chapter.
Sorry?
Your chapter, it must be wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Sorry,
Yeah.
Henrik.
No, do you know when it's going to be published? Because I have
Yes,
no idea.
we're talking about it going. It's with the publishers now, so they're talking about going to print January next year. I've been in contact with Nutmeg Hallett, who I think you know, don't you, Henrik? And that's her recent response to me, that it should be about January next year. So when it's published, perhaps we'll all come together and celebrate that. I certainly won't be working for the NHS anymore. Thank you, everyone. I think I'll leave it there, Henrik, if that's okay with you, and give others a chance.
Yeah,
but I'm
so
going to
much.
stay. I'm going to stay and listen to everyone else.
Now it's Sarah's turn, and you don't.